Black Myths podcast is an informative conversational show analyzing popular myths about Black culture of a socio-political nature.
Translation, we just debunking the bullshit that be said about Black people. Welcome to the Black Myths podcast. Welcome to the Black Myths podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. I'm here with our co-host, Cameron. We are going to be the host for today. This is the opening of our series with the Indianapolis Library, Black Myths of Black History. Today, the opening myth is the Malcolm X movie is accurate. And we are here with Dr. Jared Ball, who is a father, a professor, a teacher over at Morgan State University. He is the author of A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Marable's Malcolm X book, Correcting Marable's Malcolm X, and he is the editor of that book. He is the editor of that book along with Todd Stephen Burrows. That book is a collection of a variety of scholars and activists and researchers in response to trying to be as objective as I can, in response to a book that had a lot of scholarly flaws. So Dr. Ball has been deeply involved with the conversation around Malcolm X, what he means to the Black radical struggle, what he means to the so-called Black community, et cetera. Just to give people a few clarifications on what we're about as the Black Myths podcast, we cover Black myths in Black history, Black myths currently. Our goal here, as it is with every show, is not to debunk things in a sense of trivia. So this is not Black Jeopardy or anything of that nature where we're just telling you Black facts for the sake of facts. We're here interested in what are the deeper implications of these things, what does it mean, and how do people organize around myths, and what policies get created around them, what is the political responses to things. That's what we're interested in. So that's the same with this movie being accurate or not. We're not interested in what color suit Malcolm had on, or how many white women he slept with. Like, these are not really important questions to the matter. So we're interested in accuracy in the sense of what was in the film and what was not in the film, or what was just simply lied about in the film, and how does that shape our understanding of not just Malcolm X as an individual, but the ideas, the movements, the organizations around the world that he represented. Cameron, you got anything you want to add to that?
Just like to stamp that this isn't to just, slander the film for what it is, but also to just point out the things that were left out and the impact that has on us as a people and our understanding of Malcolm X as a whole.
So without further ado, Dr. Ball, I know you have this interesting philosophy on Black media, which I think is important to help frame this conversation. So would you like to explain that and just further take the floor?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say thanks to the both of you for hosting this conversation. And I'm always honored to be invited to take part in these kinds of discussions. And I also want to shout out libraries and librarians who have played an underappreciated role in advancing progressive struggle in this country for a long time.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking even specifically recently, a bit of history that's gotten, I think, overlooked is the role librarians have played in the post 9/11 era in protecting some freedom of information and speech. So anyway, it's just a shout out to libraries and librarians. I think they're important. And anyway, the philosophy, wow, it's almost, wow, it's getting to be almost 30 years ago already. I was delivering pizzas, and this brother that I worked with named Vernon, we were hanging out, and he a graduate of Morgan State University. Shout out to that as well. And we were hanging out one night after work, and he just started, we were talking about movies and life or whatever. And he said, I'm not going to see any more movies with Black people in them. And I was shocked. And I said, how could that be? And he said, because we never look good. They always make us look bad. So as much as I love movies, I'm just going to only see movies with whites and Asians and whoever else, because I don't want to see any of us in films anymore. And so my joke is, that 30 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, student loan debt later, I've come to the similar conclusion that whether it's theoretically based in critical media literacy or Africana studies or even Marxist theory or certainly anti-colonial theory, these variety of approaches, that is, that if you look at the political function and role that popular and in this case commercial national media play in any society, and particularly this one, that is the United States, it stands to reason that African people, Black people in particular, but really any group of oppressed people should at best look critically, if at all, at popular commercial media that portends to nominally represent their stories or tell their stories or reflect their lives, especially when we like it, that we should be even more critical of it. And the point being that in almost every case, the purpose of that story being told is to appease some broader political or ideological function of the state, of the power structure, those who rule. So that what we end up getting is almost always a curated and manicured version of what is, again, nominally meant to be us, but is really only there to appease those who rule, and in particular, specifically, in terms of marketing in this country at least, white, affluent audiences. So when you start to think of it that way, it's a lot easier, I think, to interpret. And really the point of what I end up calling the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance is in some ways meant to be comical, but it's really, it's more meant to be a serious sort of intellectual self-defense mechanism. It's not meant to even necessarily be a call for boycotting or anything material. Right. It's just to say, look, because I know we're going to engage this media one way or another, but we should be engaging it extremely critically, again, if at all. So that's basically what I'm trying to say. Okay,
so you're not saying, just for the ears out there, I'm not asking this for myself, but you're not saying this is a conspiratorial, or are you saying, or is it a conspiratorial, there's a conspiracy to make all of us look bad in movies, or are you saying it's just the way that the system kind of like comes together to create these to package these type of things?
Well, on the one hand, I always I agree, for instance, what Noam Chomsky said many years ago, that people label things as conspiracy theory just to discourage institutional analysis.
Right.
Or as I've heard attributed to Ishmael Reed, you can call me a conspiracy theorist if you acknowledge yourself as a coincidence theorist. But it doesn't really matter. The end result is ultimately the same. But no, I'm ultimately saying that a lot of it happens unconsciously and ideologically. And if we had time, we could really go through some of the arguments there. But then I'm also arguing that we don't have to speculate, because it is documented in the written literature and documents and declassified uncovered materials in terms of counterintelligence program and other endeavors of the state, that there has been for instance, you could just read the literature of the founding of the field of communication studies here in the United States, and the people who put it together are very clear that there is a political function to popular media, that this is not, and they even make it clear themselves, this is not about entertainment. We're encouraged to believe it's entertainment. Yeah. They're couching it as entertainment, but it's really meant to carry very deep-seated political messages. It's meant to even perform the function of just merely, in some cases historically, getting people literally off of the streets and into theaters, to gather them, to create a new public sphere, to make it more easily to propagandize them. So it's not a matter of me saying it's a conspiracy theory. It's just a matter of looking at the documents themselves, of those who have laid all of this out, and they have said themselves very clearly, we need to propagandize our audience, our community, our citizens, one, to make them citizens, to create the concept again of citizen as consumer, and to create concepts of capitalism being wedded to democracy. I mean, all this is in their literature, in their statements, and then their expressed, designed, projects. So again, yeah. So it's not some deep-seated conspiracy in the sense that we're encouraged to believe or hear when we hear that, respond when we hear that phrase. It is a well-documented and established pattern and process.
Right.
It's like, it's important to continuously be critical of what we're consuming across the board, the music that we listen to, the ads that we're seeing, the books that we read. The teacher in me like immediately goes to when we're teaching kids about persuasive writing, like, what is your purpose as an author? Like, what are you aiming to do? Is this to inform, to entertain, to persuade? And who's your audience? And then, like, when you take something foundational like that and put it a step up, who's funding these films? Who's funding your television shows? Who's actually giving you the green light on what you can and cannot do? It's been well documented from actors, directors, writers, musicians about, having a vision and then taking it to people and they go, actually, that's not what we want. We're not going to give you the money to fund that. And so people then go back and they cut it out and they make inserts that are a little more palatable for folks.
To the film, it's interesting we bring that up because one of the people who originally worked on the screenplay, Arnold Pearl, along with James Baldwin, was actually blacklisted for some of those quote unquote communist activities, ironically.
But that's a really important point, just to quickly highlight.
No, go ahead.
That the reason people like him were so-called blacklisted or red listed was because of this broader concern that media were going to be turned into weapons for communism, for labor, the labor class, for working people, never mind anything about positive Black imagery and liberation. So even before it got to an issue of race, at least in terms of this conversation, there was this broader concern of the white working class and what was going to happen with film, which initially, because the history of film initially, and again, this gets into a whole other thing we don't have time for either, about why it ends up historically, why Jews, for instance, are in the position to be so dominant to this day in that industry. It's not some deep conspiracy as it's often encouraged for us to believe. It's because Jews were left to Hollywood, to build Hollywood, because the Gentile elite didn't have any use for a popular culture at that time. And they didn't want the elite. They said, go ahead and make your little vaudeville and your plays and then your movies. That's for the regular people. The elite go to opera, the elite go to theater, the elite go to, their elite spaces, the ballet. So that's the reason why poor Jews with nothing ended up being able to build this monstrous thing called Hollywood that, again, we don't have time to get into now, that the state would later come into and take over and has been really running ever since. So for very, again, political specific purposes, in this case, starting with the idea of crushing the threat of communism, which obviously for increasingly mistreated working people would to this day be a very appealing idea.
No, thanks for highlighting that. And I know you note that some of this in your book, the Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, particularly the melding together of capitalism and democracy. We had talked about that also on our episode, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised 1 and 2. Just for people who want to get further into the conversation, since we could easily go down that road, but we want to work our way to this film. But that is an important point. I think hopefully all these things help give people context. Once we talk about the film, think about all of these different factors, and this is what goes into making any type of media, specifically popular media in this country, when it's funded by major studios and stuff. And it's about someone like Malcolm X. It's not just so you can go eat popcorn. That's never been how this works. So the rights to the autobiography was purchased by Marvin Worth, who apparently, I guess, had some type of relationship with Malcolm X. He at least he knew him from his hustling days, according to Worth. And it went through variations. We talked about with Arnold Peele and James Baldwin actually had written a script. I guess it was turned to a book one day when I was lost, a scenario based on Alex Haley's autobiography of Malcolm X. and that didn't get made. Baldwin was heavily drinking at the time, was going through depression, essentially because he had lost all of his friends from the 60s. So he probably wasn't in the best shape to assassination, by the way, not just out of personal whatever. Like his friends were literally assassinated. So he probably wasn't in the best shape. And then it just goes through, we're not going to get to everybody's hands, but it goes through a variety of people's hands. We get to the Malcolm X film, and initially a white director, you remember his name, Dr. Ball?
Norman Jewison.
Yes. He was supposed to make the film, and then there was a protest, I believe, about him making the film. This is also,
and even that was disputed, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, some said that never happened, and that Spike created that controversy to get support for himself to get the film. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean.
No, that's important because I was like 3 years old.
Like, let me get my popcorn for.
Yeah. I was like 3 years old, so I wasn't even there, and I tried to read more than just Wikipedia because I know they only limit. I try to read their sources, which was helpful. The stuff that they link is usually where the truth is. So I read some of that, but yeah. So there was a lot of that got pushed. At least according, if you read through the Wikipedia narrative, it's a lot of like Amir Baraka was, forcing, and Spike Lee was like, nobody has ownership of Malcolm's legacy and all this. So do you want to just kind of take it from there? I mean, I could go all day on that, but yeah.
I'm gonna try to find it, and I would be very disappointed in myself if I didn't make sure I kept a copy or even put it on my website somewhere. But I used to have this classic debate between, well, it was a sort of debate, but it was really an assessment of the film that featured Amiri Baraka, the late Dr. John Henrik Clarke, and the very much still alive Dhoruba bin Wahad, and the late great Alombe Brath, by the way. I mean, these are some Pan-African giants in early this about 1991 or two, maybe just before the film actually came out. And in that discussion, they talk a lot about this history, and it'd be great as a refresher for anyone. But essentially, what they were talking about and what did happen, or was at least disputed. There was some dispute. I can't say it did for certain, but it was alleged that, again, Spike Lee created the controversy around Norman Jewison getting the film so that he could say, how could you let a white man get this film, and create this buzz not only around the film and the project, but around Spike getting the film as director. Mm-hmm. And then once he secured that, there was this controversy and debate that, and for people who may not, fully appreciate, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice here, but some of these names, Amiri Baraka not only, knew Malcolm X, but is, considered, if not by everyone, by many to be the founder of the Black Arts movement. I mean, this is having had the pleasure of meeting him and dealing with his work. I mean, this was somebody that intellectually is unparalleled. I mean, yeah. So anyway, but and John Henrik Clarke was neither of them would have wanted to use the word, but some would say the Jegna to Malcolm X. I mean, somebody who advised him and knew him intellectually as a young man coming up for years. And it was on John Henrik Clarke's living room floor that he and Malcolm X drafted the outline for the Organization of Afro-American Unity based on the Organization of African Unity on the continent. So these are people that knew Malcolm politically and personally.
John Henrik Clarke wrote a great book, or he edited a great book as well on Malcolm X. This is Malcolm X, A Man in His Times. This is, I rarely ever buy physical books, but this is one of the few I had to get.
It's essential. Yeah. You got to have it.
Yeah.
But anyway, the long story short is that these, and Alombe Brath, by the way, a Pan-African legend himself. I mean, anyway, so when these men come together and say, Spike, we've seen the script and we have problems with it. Spike, ran this hustle to get control of the film. Spike, why does it take so long to get to Malcolm as Malcolm? Where are his Pan-African and nationalist politics and internationalist politics in the film? When they come together to say this, it should have carried, some weight. And by the way, I'll share his story too. When after the film came out and after I had seen it, and of course been dealing politically with the people that I just mentioned and others. Spike Lee came around here to Maryland to give a talk, and I did as a younger man go up to the mic and and basically try to challenge him on his depiction of Malcolm.
What I would have given to be there for that.
I mean, it was a funny moment. They cut my mic, and it was just, and he didn't like it because he was there to promote himself and to promote, and basically to tell Black audiences how to support financially his and other people's work. And I was trying to raise a question about, well, where's Malcolm's politics? Because, and I'll stop here, but as Daruba bin Wahad said, when you see a movie about Malcolm, you're supposed to come out and be ready to get into a revolution. And when people come out of that movie, it's something very different. I think it does start with the fact that it takes 90 minutes into that film before you see Malcolm as Malcolm X. So, that's why politically he is largely erased in that film. And
even in the first 90 minutes, a lot of the foundational things about Malcolm X are left out. One of the things that we talked about prior was just the notion of you don't actually learn much about Malcolm X in his formative years, about his family history. And that is so influential to who he actually becomes. He didn't just become Malcolm X overnight. It wasn't just because he found the Nation of Islam. It wasn't just because of all of the things from his teenagers up. And so that's something that we wanted to start off. What do you think what was significantly missing in the beginning of the movie, and why do you think it was left out?
Well, I mean, I think one easy one that we could pick is the Garveyism of his father. We could start with just simply that. The experiences of his father, which are largely whittled down to the alleged killing on the train track, which is also disputed historically.
Yeah.
We could have learned much more about the experiences of his mother, other than just seeing her deteriorate psychologically. But for me personally, honestly, I think, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to Malcolm and his family and all that could have been added to this film. I mean, they could have done, there's so much about that time. I mean, you had so many, you could have talked about Malcolm's upbringing during a time. I mean, the man is born in 1925. He's born the same year of Frantz Fanon in Martinique and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, the Pan-African triumvirate, heroic, they could have built something on that and shown the three of them in their early, look at all that was going on in the world between the Pan-Africanist conferences themselves, or Hubert Henry Harrison and and Cyril Briggs, African Blood Brotherhood, and I mean, anyway, there's just so many things that could have been discussed to contextualize the world into which Malcolm was born and evolving. You could have talked about the relationship of the Black struggle to the Communist Party as it sort of hit a height in the 1930s, as Malcolm was becoming a young boy in the child. I mean, there's so many things that could have been talked about that they don't talk about. But for me personally, I would rather them have sped up. If you only have 2 or 3 hours to do a story, speed up to the point where Malcolm is Malcolm X, the post-prison, experience, and even more to my liking, the end of in the post-Nation of Islam experience. I mean, the film does nothing to talk about his internationalism and the trips around the world that he made. The film doesn't do anything to show us his discussion with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. It doesn't, I mean, we don't get any of that. So, and so what we get is a bunch of dancing, a bunch of, licking the white woman's toes, and the burglary and the Russian roulette and the gangsterism. And you can even see, because we those who might remember or know the history that Spike ran out of money. So you can see at the beginning of the film, the elaborate sets and the dancing and all of this. and then it it almost feels like it's running out literally as the film ends. Because they had to go to Oprah and Bill Cosby to get money, and that's a whole other thing. If you go to Time Warner, who said they wanted to popularize Malcolm X and make him a brand like The Simpsons and Batman, and then you go to Oprah and Bill Cosby, who people like me were complaining about politically long before all of these other, Bill Cosby allegations, took him down. Like if you go to these people, what kind of film could you expect? I mean, Daphne Brooks wrote the classic essay about Oprah and her book club being about appeasing a white, affluent female audience. That's who Oprah was. That's who Oprah's career target audience was. So how is she going to help bring a film about Malcolm X to the public that is going to address itself to any other community? In other words, so my point is, they're not going to invest in a film that's going to promote the aspects of Malcolm X that the state and other Black bourgeoisie and civil rights mainstream leaders have been wanting to run from their entire lives. Specifically, and again, I'll stop here: Pan-Africanism, socialism, nationalism, and even more specifically, guerrilla warfare. I mean, that's an aspect of his life that nobody talks about. This was not a man who was just talking about let's build with King and move to electoral politics and vote for somebody like Obama. This was somebody that was saying we're going to run literally the gamut from the ballot to the bullet. Everything is on the table one way or another. He meant by any means necessary. We just say it. Mm-hmm. He meant it and was literally building this way, but we can't see any of that in a film. That's going to end with burning the American flag into an X and everybody saying I am Malcolm X and all this silliness. It's just absurd. It's absurd.
We could kind of jump around because I think to kind of cover.
I think I did anyway, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, we good. It's cool.
You pointed out everything.
There was no way we were gonna stay in order here, but now I think with the family thing, kind of to Cameron's point, I think that my issue with the family part, or even the Garveyism part, which if you don't know what Garveyism is, you should probably look that up. But anybody, this is a very, 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 very oversimplified version. But anybody has heard the phrase "Back to Africa," that's largely related to him, but not only related to him. And again, that's very oversimplified, just to stay on conversation. But his father was a Garveyite. His father did preach that ideology. So his father was killed. The movie doesn't really seem to get it even at this. His father was killed, not just because he was, I'm a man, not just because he was just shouting it at the Klan, but because he actually advocated for like Black self-determination, Black ownership, Black autonomy. He wasn't perfect or anything, but that was something that was influenced by Malcolm. That influenced Malcolm. So by the time Malcolm gets, even after he goes through the streets and everything like that, by the time he gets to prison, a major historical inaccuracy is the prison situation where his family is who introduces him to the Nation of Islam, and Garveyism is already something they know. So this idea of Black people having their own and kind of being a separate nation was not this, oh my God, I've never heard of this before. You mean we can do something without the white man? Like that, there's no way Malcolm would have said that because his whole family was exposed to it. So the brother Baines character in the film never existed in any form. There's a brother he meets when he first gets in prison. I think his name was Bimbe or something of that nature, who was not a Muslim or anything, but he was just well read and like if you're in prison, there are always brothers like that who are just well read about a variety of topics, and he impressed Malcolm, and Malcolm actually starts to read previous to even getting involved in any type of NOI business. That brother impressed him. So Malcolm, who he says was pretty much illiterate at the time because he was drugs and everything, starts to learn to read, and then his brother Reginald, his youngest brother, is the one who comes to prison and actually introduces him to it after he had received writings from the rest of his family who was in the Nation of Islam. And he even says in the book, in the autobiography, that this was something that was not unnatural to them because they had all been introduced to these ideas as children.
And I think that's something that is so important to recognize, like a huge part of why the Nation of Islam appealed to him, because it had already it was already discussing the very things that were at his core. His parents were already talking to people and were targeted because they were teaching people about how to grow your own food, how to farm, how to be self-sufficient, how to do for yourselves, instead of having to go to white people who were going to upcharge you, who were going to disrespect you in that process. And so to then have just found a love of knowledge in prison already and have just been reading and consuming information, and then to have your own family come tell you, like, we have found something that has that has given us a larger purpose.
The black man's true religion, I think, is what they refer to.
Yeah, the black man's true religion, because prior to that, they talk about how Malcolm X was pretty turned off to religion as a whole.
Yeah, and so chapter was actually called Satan, because that's what they referred to him as. Yeah.
Yeah. And so to see, and I think that's something that in the film we don't get to see. So it seems as if, you know, Malcolm X's like woke moment is his coming to the nation. And that's so far from the truth. Like, the nation was something that rerouted a purpose for Malcolm X that had been stopped for a while, because he had gotten into the to drugs and into hustling, into gambling. And I also think that is something that is largely left out. They make it seem like Malcolm X was just this gangster and he just fell and then he got into drugs and he just was like really not knowledgeable about that. But it was so much more. He was actually a really skilled hustler. Like, yeah. I think that phrase is used so loosely now, but anybody who knows a hustler means like they know what to do, how to do it, and how to get it. Like, we will say Malcolm X was the connect back in the days. You know, from working the trains, he talks about how, you know, he paid attention to what people were wanting. He was a concierge of sorts. He knew that he wasn't going to make money just working on the train, but he started to connect people. He was like, oh, you want girls? You want to find out where the music is, where the food is? You need X, Y, and Z. I'm now your connect. I'm your middleman. And that was actually some of the beginnings of his hustling. And he was a lot smarter than I think the film plays out.
Yeah, even as a so-called hustler, like that's what I'm saying. I agree with Dr. Ball. They should have sped it up. But if you're gonna do it, at least give us a nuance, or give us a real idea of who he was as a hustler. He, in the movie, he's just like gets off a ship or gets off a train in a bright suit, goes into a bar, hits somebody over the head with a bottle, meets West Indian Archie, starts working for him, changes his suit. West Indian Archie's ready to kill him. He goes and tries to rob people with his white woman, who did not ever live in New York, for the record. Like, she used to come down from Boston, and then they go to prison, and then he's like, oh my God, I'm black. Like, that's kind of the essential narrative. And it's like, even if you just read a biography or an autobiography, let alone any of the other sources that people should engage, it's not just that. So I guess the question, Dr. Ball, is like, how did his street life influence his political influences? I think that's a part that Malcolm tried to make in his own book that gets left out.
Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to highlight the point that I think you both made that should be pointed out. The Garvey movement, you know, what Marcus Garvey created, still to this day, the largest Black international movement, was the first target of the pre-FBI by Hoover and the state. So this whole idea of them and the father being targeted is not, some, again, far-fetched conspiracy, but needs to be understood as something explicitly expressed by Hoover and the state from very early on as a concern. The idea being that it's not just back to Africa, that Black unity and unified collective Black pride and endeavor and, you know, community is untenable and not ever has been the desire or in the interest of those in power. So anyway, the way, at least that I remember the connection, is that Malcolm developed, really what Malcolm was doing was, as you both, I think, pointed out already, was applying whatever we would call street smarts and whatever honing of that he developed as he, you know, applied his trade to an organizational level. I mean, others like, I think later on, somebody like George Jackson did the same kind of thing, that if you, once you recognize, first of all, an institution, once you have an institutional analysis, even as a so-called criminal, that is, you understand how society works, you understand what people are encouraged to want, and where they're encouraged to go to get it, and what they're willing to do to go to get it. And then you start to realize, working backwards from that, the many ways in which the so-called system is rigged. Right. And the way, the sort of the undercurrents work. I mean, I've never, for instance, been highly involved in any illicit activity, but having been in communication with those who have, almost all of them unanimously from across, really around the world, actually, have all pointed to the routine and heavy involvement of the police in managing all that's supposed to be the illegal trade that they're supposed to be engaged in. In other words, they start to learn, working backwards, the mechanism and the function of the state, and how politics are carried out in real time, beyond the mythologies were given in school books or Saturday morning cartoons. And then once you start to, I think, as he did, Malcolm, that is, work backwards again from the street hustle to the so-called macro institutional analysis and process of societal rule, it's like, you can start to fill in the gaps. It is, okay, well, if I know that in one setting I need to move organized bodies in unison to achieve a certain task, whether that's robbing a house or selling a drug, to I need to move organized people in another fashion to get liberty and freedom. Working within the system and its wants and needs, encouragements, discouragements, and policing surveillance apparatus, whether you surveillance in the street from the police on low-level drug and criminal activity, to the high-level state surveillance that he ended up suffering, obviously, or maybe less obviously, at the end of his life. Anyway, that's how I always have understood him to have done what he was doing, and how he was making those connections. And I think he did, unfortunately, too well, to the point where those apparatuses had to turn on him with a focus that I think most of us really don't want and can't handle.
And I think, to one more story in the hustler life that we don't want to spend too much time like the movie does on it. But I think the one that always stuck out to me was the draft dodging story that didn't make the movie. I just found that story to be hilarious, and just showed his genius as a hustler. Because just for folks who've never read the book or never heard the story, this is during the time, would have been of World War II, and they have the draft board, and it was just crazy when just reading it. Like, the draft board will find you if you don't sign up. Like, they were very serious about this. We don't understand what that's like now, because there's technically no longer a draft, even though you still do sign. But there's technically no longer a draft. But back then, the draft board would find you. Even someone of who's not working a normal job, they still would come and find you out in the street. So he knew this. So he puts down what he calls the wire, which is just what we today call the streets. He puts the word out in the streets. He just starts acting like he's literally lost his mind. Like, he's just saying crazy stuff. I'm gonna go down the South and get me some guns and kill me some white people. Like, he's really just putting this out in the street in public, just acting like a fool. So by the time he gets called down to the office, he's already established his narrative that he's a little off. Then he talks about how there was a black woman in the office who was like, Malcolm talks, he's like, she's probably one of those integrated Negro types or whatever. He's like, I could tell it already annoyed her, because he's just shouting, I'm going to South. I ain't going to the war. So when he gets in the office with the white man, and the dude's trying to, I think it was a psychologist or something, trying to evaluate him, this dude already thinks he's a bit off. And then he says he walks around the room, looks under the door, and then he's like, hey man, I'm about to go get me some guns and kill me some crackers. You want to do it with me, or something to that effect? And then he's essentially evaluated as being unfit for war, but he knew what he was doing. the whole time. But having that level of genius to make those connections, essentially to just stay out of trouble, to your point, to work operating backwards. Once you turn that type of mind into a political mind, that's a problem.
Absolutely.
That's,
it reminds me of that scene in Life where Eddie Murphy says, "Boss, you don't want to give me that gun. I might just shoot you with it."
Which Malcolm said that in his opposition to the Vietnam in that speech. He was like,
"But I'm not that dumb. For me, and I can only speak for myself, I'll go to jail. I'll go to prison. Stick me in jail. Let me go to prison. Right. Don't give me your uniform. And don't give me your rifle, because I might use it on someone that you don't intend for me to use. Don't never put me in your airplane and fill it with bombs and tell me go bomb the enemy. Well, I don't have the far to go to find that enemy. No.
I can't prove this, but there is, to draw some of these connections, there is, a Hollywood liaison office in the Pentagon that will withdraw support and funding for films and access to materials for films that don't portray the military in a positive light.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, so I mean, so as you remind me of that fact, and one reason why we might not have seen a scene like that in a film is that you don't want to portray a situation where you need Black people to enlist, a situation where a Black man, a prominent Black figure, is coming up with ways to not enlist and not participate. And then, by the way, Spike Lee would later be conscripted to make promotional films, recruitment films for the Navy and the Army targeted at Black and brown audiences. So anyway,
the irony.
Yeah, can't prove it, but that's worth looking into.
That's just interesting. Interesting coincidences for sure.
So we know that Malcolm X finds the nation, and he reaches out to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But before we even talk about that progression, what was the state of the nation before he even got into it officially?
So sure, I mean, the Nation of Islam obviously existed and had a several decade long history. I don't remember the exact date of origin that they point to, but obviously with Ward Fard Muhammad having built it up before Elijah Muhammad. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think it was 1931, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds.
Somewhere in the
I thought that's
30s.
when Elijah Poole joins joins Fard Muhammad. But anyway, somewhere around somewhere around there. But it certainly wasn't the powerhouse that it would become. It was more or less a small. One of many existing political and religious organizations in the Black political religious organizations in the country. It had itself been monitored, put under surveillance, like many others, by the state. Even documents on Fard Muhammad going back to the early 20th century, early 1900s. But when Malcolm got involved and became a member, and certainly when he got out of prison in 50, why do I want to say 3, but
52.
By the time he comes out, he builds the nation into something much larger. And again, I don't remember the figures off the top of my head, what are projected or alleged or estimated figures, but it I don't know. A tremendous increase.
In the documentary that we were talking about before we got on, Make It Plain, they said it was only 400 people, around the time Malcolm joined. I don't know. I mean, you said it was based on Bill Strickland's book, so there has to be some research behind that. But I don't.
I wouldn't dispute Strickland on that. And shout out to Strickland, who contributed to our Lie of Reinvention as well. But so I wouldn't dispute that. If that's what they said, that sounds about right. Then I would say that's about right. But and then I'm not sure if the documentary talks about what the size of the numbers were after Malcolm got involved, but he through again, going back to what we were talking about before, if you have an understanding of how society and the streets work, you understand that people in the community, just as there are people who have a need for drugs or women or criminal connections, or what are said to be criminal connections or criminalized activity, I should say, then you know that there's also as much a need in the community and an interest in the community for liberation.
Yeah.
So you just start trying to feed that, in those same skill sets of oration. We also should, make a quick nod to the fact that Malcolm was also tremendously influenced by the Harlem tradition of street corner oration and oratory. So that, they show some of that in the movie, putting Al Sharpton up there, which is, a nice bit of, anyway, oh, good Lord.
Bobby Seale was there too.
Bobby Seale was there. Bobby
Yeah,
Seale
yeah.
was one of them. At least that's a little bit more, anyway, what can I say? But Malcolm was, obviously, inspired by that and among the best at that. And started being able to sort of bridge what he was inspired by and learning from Elijah Muhammad with his other skill set to increase the flock, so to speak. And he became one of the more prominent ministers and spokespeople, and increasingly became a target for those, of course, as is often emphasized, those jealous within the nation, but also by those who were more concerned politically by the state. And then in 1959, when CBS and Mike Wallace make that error that mainstream media has been correcting ever since, of putting Malcolm X on national TV in the segment that Hate produced, in an attempt to discredit Malcolm in the nation and to promote the more acceptable NAACP, it failed. Because as anybody to this day, I mean, to this day, I say it all the time. Go on YouTube and turn on a Malcolm X speech and tell me you're not moved. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot do it.
It's impossible.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
There is not just a power in his voice, but his ability to just connect to every aspect of your humanity. And I think that is just so impactful. And it's why people flocked to join the nation. And even people who weren't politically aligned with what the nation stood for at the time, like still followed Malcolm extensively. And even after his departure, those numbers did not decrease significantly. People were still flocking to hear from Malcolm. People were sneaking, who were still involved in the nation, to hear, turning on their radios, because when he opened his mouth to speak, you knew you needed to listen. And you knew you weren't going to be fed lies. And I think that was something that was so ingrained in just like who he was and his integrity, but also something that eventually led to a part of the view of his downfall, was because what had drawn him to the nation was his ability to find truth in what they stood for, his ability to find truth in a father-like relationship and Elijah Muhammad, and what they stood for, and his ability to identify and to be unashamed to name why the conditions for Black folks were the way they were.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't even have anything to add to that. I just want to say absolutely.
I think the thing that gets left out with him in the nation for me was him as an organizer. It's kind of what we've been getting at. So he wasn't just like giving speeches. As much as we love his speeches, as much as moving his speeches were, like his recruitment was unmatched. I mean, again, if you go from 400 people to I think a soft number was like 80,000, 100,000 people, somewhere in there at the height of it. A lot of it was due to the failed mistake of the Hate produced. But even before that, he had established mosque in Philly. He had established mosque in Boston. And that's where his sister Ella eventually gets involved. That's actually where Farrakhan starts, for those who don't know. He'd established mosque all across the East Coast. to the point where he was given the Mosque 7 in New York, in Harlem. And eventually, by the time he was assassinated, there were 3 mosques just in New York by itself. So you don't do that by just giving speeches. Like you know, that's just a part of it, right? Like, so you're actually going into the gutter, recruiting people, and he's not doing this by himself. I don't want to make that mistake either. Like, this is still a group effort, but I'm saying, as far as somebody that's leading that, like, he talks about in his book, when he gets out of prison and he's in Detroit, and it's like he's talking to his brother, I think Filbert, like, yo, why ain't anybody here? Like, he was like, we need to get some people here. So he talks about how going from like a small, basically corner storefront to having these huge mosques and talking in the Chicago Coliseum when they had I think what would be known as Savior's Day today, when they were having those meetings. Like, that takes the large organizing capacity. So when I hear people on the civil rights side of this, since people love to make these separations or divides, they act, what did Malcolm ever do? He just gave speeches. You know, he never.
Oh, no. See, there's so much that gets left out. I mean, you make a great point, and to add to that just a little bit is, you know, he built up not alone, and he didn't originate it, but he did build up the Muhammad Speaks newspaper.
Yeah,
he helped increase its journalism. Just so it became, to this day, even the final call. Maybe less so right now, but even in recent history, has had an importance as a news outlet far beyond the nation. He also was able to benefit not only from the existing, as small as it was, it does help that he had some structure of an organization to work within. And then beyond that, he benefited from an international struggle that he ultimately felt the Nation of Islam was too slow to participate in.
right.
So the world was almost encouraging, unlike in a way today, despite, you know, maybe some parallels, but unlike, I think, in a way today, there was a global uprising that in many ways was more connected and unified, and encouraging of the involvement of Black people here, or the leadership of Black people here. And then, of course, he had the competing civil rights movement happening in the United States that also propelled interest in even what he was doing. So by the time he comes around and he does this tireless work of, as you said, not just giving speeches, but going everywhere to help build organization, help building newspaper, help building the apparatus of ministers within the Nation of Islam, and the military apparatus within the Fruit of Islam, by the way. While he's doing all of this, it's tireless work, but I think also it had a way of catching hold in the community, maybe in a way that we don't see today. But you know, so by the time people heard him, and then he comes in with that brilliant analysis, and you know, he's laying it down, you know, the way he did, it was obviously going to be successful.
To the point of speeches, one to kind of hone in on a certain point in history, and I think this is completely left out of the movie as well. This is something I think John Henry Clark does a good job of highlighting, is the message to the grassroots. And that particular speech, that's my favorite speech by anyone ever on the earth, you know, before or in the future.
Pretty sure he knows it line for line.
Yeah, but that particular speech, we actually did an episode talking about a portion of it. We couldn't do the whole thing, but that particular speech represented, you know, everybody talks about the infidelities and all of that. I don't really think we need to speak much on that, because that's one thing that does get a lot of attention in the film. But there was also a political break. And I think John Henry Clark pointed out, if you listen to any speech before the message to the grassroots, Malcolm always says, you know, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us. And this speech was in 1963. I don't remember the exact month. And this is the first speech where Malcolm did not say that. So what was some of that background disagreement going on? Also to connect that to the nationals or the international struggle that you've been alluding to the whole time.
Well, I mean, I think the real tension was that Malcolm wanted to get more aggressively involved in that international struggle, and the Nation of Islam wasn't about that. I think Malcolm was increasingly wanted to pinpoint capitalism and colonialism and imperialism as problems, and that wasn't, you know, in the Nation of Islam's interest. Of course, the Nation of Islam you know, even to this day is largely a Black capitalist organization. So it's you know, and I, you know, so that wasn't just not their interest. The issue of the infidelities and the underage secretaries with Elijah Muhammad and all of that was obviously a real concern for Malcolm, and a moral, philosophical concern for Malcolm. But I think that was not the real tension, and the tension, I think, predates any of his concerns about that, and was more about his anxiety around what was the Nation of Islam doing or not doing as it pertains to the liberation struggle of his people. And I almost think I could understand that, having been around the nation at least a little bit myself, and seeing them even just as a spectator, when you see them, you know, roll up in uniform and in sync, you know, and you know, and in step, and they got, you know, the brothers in line and looking, you know, I mean, it's impressive, and it's like, yeah. I'm, you know, and I could only imagine, like, if I'm in that, and if I'm a leader in that, and there's a global struggle going on, I'm going to be among the first ones to say, where are we in organizing that, or bringing that organization to the street? You know, so when you start hearing, you know, Malcolm's frustration over, for instance, police violence, I mean, I think you can. It's palpable to say, how can we be this well organized and prepared to defend ourselves, and we're not protecting everybody and getting more, you know, engaged. Again, I could also understand why the response from higher up would be what it was, but again, I think that was the real tension that is often encouraged to be suppressed beneath the more scandalous issue over infidelity and underage secretaries, which is not, I mean, I don't mean to diminish that as a concern, right. But for instance, my point is that when you read the counterintelligence program documents from the FBI, they read that Elijah Muhammad, along with others, is a threat to the security, the national security of the United States, not because he's, you know, messing around with girls and multiple women, but because he's encouraging Black people to engage Black nationalism. Right. So in other words, my point is always the same. You know, when people always want to, you know, raise this nonsense about Dr. King's doctorate or his infidelity on Coretta, I always try to politely remind them, as bad as any of that may have been, if it was in fact real, that's not why he was targeted for assassination and targeted as a threat to national security. You can read the documents themselves. The FBI and the State Department is not saying Dr. King is a threat because of whatever he's doing overseas in hotel rooms. It's because he is encouraging Black people to engage with radical politics and international global struggle. So the same thing applies to Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad and Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, all of whom were mentioned in the COINTELPRO documents from the beginning as threats to galvanizing and unifying and becoming the messiah that will bring a Black nationalist radical movement to being. So that's what I think that the real tension was. And then, of course, the counterintelligence program had, in fact, placed agents. Even before it was known as COINTELPRO, there were undercover agents in the Nation of Islam. There were undercover agents working within Malcolm's post-Nation of Islam organizations. And there were certainly elements within the State Department and the media apparatus all playing a role in projecting images and messaging meant to discourage the work that he was involved in long before the state was involved with his actual assassination.
And they fomented even the beef between him and Elijah Muhammad, right? Like that was
absolutely.
There's letters, just like they did with the Panthers, and even the thing with Dr. King's infidelities. That was Coretta always denied that, but nobody ever brings that up. But like that was all fomented. These beefs were always fomented. These tensions and were fomented. It doesn't mean there wasn't an issue. I think what's the brother's name that wrote one of the books? Was it Zako on the assassination? He's in your book too.
Zach Kondo?
Yeah, Zakondo. Yeah, he talks about the nation. Not the nation, but the FBI's job was to plant a seed. That's how the operations worked. It wasn't just about killing people or whatever. It was to plant a seed of distrust and then watch that grow and then foment that tension. This also happens in other countries where the CIA goes into other countries and plants seeds amongst, you know, populations that might have certain tension, and they watch that blow up to become a coup, you know, or insurrection or whatever. So the FBI used to, that's not used to, but back then, as probably today, that's what they did. So I think the infidelities are important in the sense of, I think Dream Hampton once said, you know, it showed that Malcolm actually wanted to protect little girls, and nobody, when she put it that way, I thought that was a better way of looking at it versus him just being personally hurt, but actually seeing that, like, you know, these girls are vulnerable to a powerful leader and they deserve protection. And I think that doesn't get framed in that sense, right? Like actually wanting to protect vulnerable people and Malcolm's sense of compassion that he had.
The point you raise is actually one of the more important points about the failures of the film, and really the failures of the way Malcolm is often discussed in general, that his internationalist politics and what he was doing overseas is often overlooked or misunderstood. You know, for instance, I think in terms of Hollywood films, I think you get more accurate depiction of his internationalism in Will Smith's Ali. In that short scene with Malcolm overseas, I think you get more of that than you do in the whole Malcolm X film. But if you go back and look at the late Congressman John Lewis's memoir, he talks about when he was the leader of SNCC, going all over the continent of Africa on a tour that took him just behind Malcolm X's own travels. And he said that everywhere they went, every African leader said, look, we just met with Malcolm, and if you're anywhere to his political right, we don't really want to deal with you. And so Malcolm had become the international standard for Black politics. And, so you could see why that would become increasingly a problem for the State Department and the CIA, who had been following him throughout the whole process. But that kind of politics has to be left out, because if you want to create the more popular and well-accepted narrative that the film, of course, wants to champion, that Malcolm was only killed because of some silly, hood beef between him and the Nation of Islam, you have to diminish the role of the state in surveilling him, in creating the disunity between him and Elijah Muhammad, or increasing or playing upon that disunity, and then ultimately their role in Malcolm's assassination. Why is Gene Roberts among, if not the first, to Malcolm's fallen body in the Audubon Ballroom? Why had he infiltrated as an undercover Bossy agent, I believe the Bureau of Special Services investigations within the New York Police Department? Why was he involved? Why were they involved in espionage against Malcolm? And why was Gene Roberts there? If this was just some silly beef, and why was he the first one to the body? And why, as others have pointed out, was he trying to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to somebody who had suffered a shotgun blast to the chest, where most people, as far as I'm aware, understand that in that circumstance, routine CPR would only advance the oncoming threat of death, as opposed to helping with that kind of wound. So why would all of this be going on?
Yeah.
So I mean, exactly. So why, so anyway, but all of this gets to be downplayed, or has to be downplayed, in order to create the narrative of, the Nation of Islam and get your hand out of my pocket and all that other kind of stuff. When Malcolm, in his own words, at the end of his life, was saying, the things that are happening to me are beyond what the Nation of Islam is capable of. As he said, look, I trained them all. So I know what they're capable of, and things that are happening to me through the surveillance and blocking him from entering France and all that kind of stuff. This is not the ability of the Nation of Islam. This is something far more powerful. So the versions of Malcolm, the politics and the work he was doing that we see in Bill Sales' book on the Organization of Afro-American Unity, his work with the Republic of New Africa, his influence certainly on the subsequent development of the Black Panther Party. If we don't get the depths of his international travels that we learn for instance, in Marika Sherwood's work on his international travels, you have to suppress all of that, because white affluent audiences that don't want to be terrified by the man that actually existed, work is realized or accomplished through the dominant narrative of American history and progress. That is, through ultimately, as some prominent scholars have attempted to say, through the election of a Barack Obama and other prominently placed Black figures, et cetera, as opposed to realizing that what Malcolm was arguing for was anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and for a reordering of the world that wouldn't leave room for the current structures to exist.
You had brought up, I think towards the beginning of, I don't know if you had said the name, but I know I'm aware, like, the issue with him working with RAM, or just working with the underground. And I think that even within certain nationalist spaces, I mean, I think you might have been the first person I had even heard that from, honestly. I had never really heard about the underground component. I mean, I knew the Ballot of the Bullet wasn't just about voting for Democrats or anything, but I didn't know, not till maybe a few years ago, about like this idea of how he wanted to establish above ground, underground. So can you just kind of talk about that kind of in closing, and then what that meant to the struggle we've already been talking about as far as the international component?
Well, honestly, what I know is largely through Bill Sales' book and just through off-the-record conversations. But it's in Sales' book on the OAAU that he talks about this, and just to make the point that Malcolm meant what he said, that he was looking at how anti-colonial struggles were taking place around the world. When he traveled throughout the African and Arab world, and was seeing how people were engaged in anti-colonial struggle, he saw the role of guerrilla warfare in that process, and was looking to develop that as a component here in the United States. We have to remember that Malcolm was sort of an extension of the logic that was somewhat popularized by Robert and Mabel Williams before Malcolm. And Malcolm had, in fact, brought Robert Williams up to the mosque in Harlem because of the historical work that Robert Williams had done in North Carolina with the NAACP, where he revolutionized that organization by simply put that by saying that to assure peace, Black people should arm themselves and prepare to engage in arms struggle. And, you know, sort of the famous story is that the Klan would show up and Robert Williams and his crew would step out on the porch with their shotguns. The Klan would see that and drive home, and thereby assuring safety and peace. So you know, that was, you know, sort of the ethic that Robert Williams certainly, and then, you know, anyway, that's a long story, but he was connected. Malcolm certainly was inspired by that. And was inspired by, again, what he was learning from what as many Black radicals and others were learning from the struggles in Vietnam, and seeing how the Vietnamese were fighting for their independence, and those in the Congo. Malcolm X said, if you don't, you know, you can't understand what's happening in Mississippi if you don't understand what's happening in the Congo and what was happening, you know. So in other words, he was saying, look, if I want to get free like others are getting free, we have to be willing to do what others are doing to get their freedom. And if we cannot do it through the ballot, then we'll have to do it through the bullet. And that's, as Kwame Ture would later say, is not really up to us. That's up to those in power who are determining, you know, they're deciding which way it's going to have to go, because they're not allowing a peaceful transfer of power. So that was his logic. And again, we don't have to agree with it. We don't have to be comfortable with it. We don't have to be, whatever our reactions to it are, the point is, this is what that man was trying to do. So when I think what is important for us, at least at minimum, is to try to recognize why these gaps in what parts of the story are told exist. Because you cannot tell me that if it can be argued that it is attractive to an audience to see, you know, pre-prison gangsterism and radicalism and dope dealing and burglary and, you know, white women toe sucking and all of that, then certainly you can't convince me that talented filmmakers can't tell an equally compelling story that features Malcolm building, you know, guerrilla warfare groups in the United States, or traveling throughout the world and meeting with, you know, every, you know, revolutionary leader imaginable. Or, I mean, in other words, why is gunplay okay when he's putting a gun to his head or to the head of his compatriot in an apartment where gunplay is not okay.
Which didn't even happen in the
well,
film.
again, whether it did or not, why is that the
yeah.
kind of gunplay we can see, but we never see the gunplay of a different kind? And that's sort of the point I'm trying to get at, that I think is important here for us to at least consider. Even as I'll speak for myself, it is admittedly uncomfortable to deal with some of these aspects that some of our heroes have righteously considered.
And that's so important. That is one of the largest things that is left out of the film, that really takes away from why he was so heavily targeted by the NYPD and the FBI. Like, his conflict with the nation was very real. You know, he stated that, you know, had before he found out, you know, about Elijah Muhammad's infidelities, before the political, and that compounded with their political disagreements, he knew that by speaking out against the nation, that he was a dead man walking. He stated, if it had been me hearing someone else, that I would have taken them out. And so, but we also don't get the nuance to go with that of the very real threat that Malcolm X was to the FBI, to NYPD, you know, even going back
to America.
To America as a whole, you know, like even going back to the altercation in New York with Hinton, which is discussed in the movie, but they don't talk about how after that incident, the FBI was incredibly targeting Malcolm X even more, because they said for him to be able to just show up and almost snap his fingers and have people disperse, they knew that in that same notion, he could snap his fingers and have people ready with weapons to go against the establishment. And that is why he was such a threat. And so Malcolm X's life was at risk from both sides. And so when we talk about his death, it's very easy for people to just point all of the fingers at the nation. And that's not to say that there may not have been a role in that, but that wasn't the only target on his back. Like, America was very much threatened by Malcolm X. America, the FBI, the government as a whole was very much terrified, as they should have been, of what power and potential Malcolm X was aiming to spark inside of Black people.
Yeah, because it's like Dr. Bob has been getting at, like, he's looking at the struggles across the globe, and he's not just talking to just anybody, he's talking to the parliaments in these countries, right? He's talking to the presidents or whatever, however they were titled. He's talking to Nkrumah, he's talking to Nasir, and
he also had a letter. He had a letter delivered to the OAU, the Gathering of the Organization of African Unity.
Yeah.
You know, on behalf of Black America. I mean, you know, in other words, he was trying to literally bring the entire African continent to the defense of Black people here. I mean, that is just. I mean, I'm just saying that is just audacious. It is, its brilliance and the fear it must have inspired is just, you know, incalculable. So, you know, anyway, yeah.
At a time.
Look, I would encourage, just before I forget again, because I keep forgetting, forgive the interruption, but if people would, and I'm going to go back and do it myself, and I would have before tonight if I could have actually reached it. There's some reasons why I physically cannot get to the book right now, but people should go back and look at the COINTELPRO papers book put out by Jim Vanderwall and Ward Churchill, because if I'm not mistaken, they basically they show that the COINTELPRO documents, more or less, the FBI largely takes credit for the disunity between the nation and Malcolm X, and the devolving relationship that some argue ended up in his death. They take credit for that, for having fomented that disunity as a successful COINTELPRO operation. So,
yeah,
anyway, it's just, you know.
Yeah, I think it's to kind of wrap it up, but yeah, I think I was talking to somebody. Talking about OG about how we don't have any concept today of organization. Like it's just been so, but that's not because we're dumb. It's just because it's been completely moved out of the way we come to understand things. And that's been a purposeful moved by the state.
The fifth tenet, COINTELPRO number 5, as it's directed towards Black America, says specifically that every measure should be taken to make sure that Black youth are not engaged with these Black nationalist radical politics. So the most powerful state in the history of humanity targeted the Black liberation struggle, not only in its moment, but in perpetuity, to make sure that your generation would not be picking up on what was left behind. So you're right, and it is by design. It's not an accident.
Dr. Ball, we just want to say thank you for all of your insight, for all of your knowledge and your expertise today. This has been a really engaging as well as an informative conversation for us today. I could talk about Malcolm X forever. Me and Two Black will probably for the rest of forever find more things to talk about in regards to Malcolm X, but I also gained a new understanding of things that I didn't have a knowledge on today. So I hope that for any of our listeners, that they also find this to be something that was super impactful and informative for them and gave them a new understanding, not just about the Malcolm X film itself, but teaching folks to have just a more critical lens when it comes to all media in general.
Yeah, I think that was an important part. Yeah.
Well, I thank you to both of you for hosting this, and I'm always happy to come back anytime. So thank you very much for this, and it's always an honor and a pleasure to talk Malcolm X. So I'm with you on that.
Yes,
yeah, you want to go ahead and tell people where they can find you?
Everything with me can be found at imixwhatilike.org or at imixwhatilike for all your relevant social media. And we have hundreds and hours of written and audio and video work on this and related subjects. So, and it's all free. So come on through. And thank you again.
Yes, we love free. Y'all heard that. No excuses.
Yeah,
it's free.
and get for the listeners, get the book. I mean, obviously, we probably will bring you back just to talk about the Marable and the one night in Miami after Cameron watches it and all of that. But for the listeners, get the book, A Lie in Reinvention. Also get the Myth and Propaganda of Black Buying Power. When the world opens back up, I'd like to bring the ball out just to talk about that in person. But get that book and just support independent Black scholars. There's a lot of them out there that don't get a lot of props, and we try to give voice to those scholars. So again, thank you, Dr. Ball, for being on. By the way, one more note. We're finally doing a Patreon. By the time y'all hear this, the Patreon will be up. I don't even know if I'm saying Patreon correctly, but we will have a Patreon. I really don't. Like I just be seeing it on people's pages. I'm just
everybody knows what you mean. Go sign up. You know what it means. Just go sign up.
Yeah. So
donate.
Yeah. So we will finally be taking donations. So yeah, and we'll probably have more extra talks with some of our scholars on there that you won't be able to hear on our normal podcast stream. So thank you again. Thank you to the Indianapolis Public Library. We'll be back next week talking about the Talented 10th with Dr. Sharice Burden-Staley, known as Dr. CBS. And we'll get into all the myths surrounding that and what the intentions of Talented 10th was and what it ended up being and so on and so forth. But thank you.
That's a good guess too. And like Nas once said with Dr. CBS, get that one eye open like CBS.
She's going to love that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right.
Hey, thanks again. Good.